She came with nothing but a worn leather bag and a last name that meant nothing to anyone in Montana. He opened the door holding a rifle. That should have been enough to make her turn around. It wasn't, because Evelyn Pierce had already lost everything worth running back to. And Garrett Boone, with his cold eyes and colder silence, was still better than the alternative. What happened between them over one brutal winter would change everything, not just for the ranch, not just for them, for every soul foolish enough to believe that broken things can't be rebuilt. Drop your city in the comments right now. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Hit like, stay until the end, because this one is going to cost you something. The Northern Pacific locomotive groaned like an old man being asked to climb stairs he had no business climbing. Evelyn Pierce sat with her back straight and her hands folded in her lap, the way her mother had taught her. Though her mother had been dead 6 years, and the lesson felt more like a ghost than wisdom at this point. Outside the frost-laced window, the world had stopped making sense somewhere around Bismarck. The trees grew farther apart, the sky got bigger, the towns thinned out until they weren't towns at all, just a cluster of brown structures hunched against the wind like people who had given up arguing with the weather. She was 23 years old, and she had 41 cents to her name. The coin count was not an approximation. She had counted them twice that morning in the pale gray light before the other passengers woke up, partly because she needed to know, and partly because doing something with her hands kept the panic at a manageable distance. 41 cents. One carpet bag containing 2 dresses, 1 pair of work boots she'd bought secondhand from a woman in Chicago who had wider feet than she did, a wool coat with a button missing on the left cuff, and a folded newspaper advertisement she had read so many times the crease lines had started eating through the paper. Wanted. Cook. Remote ranch property, Gallatin Valley, Montana Territory. Experience required. Must be capable of hard work in difficult conditions. Inquire. Boone Ranch, Bozeman. Post office. That was it. No name, no wage offer, no description of what difficult conditions meant, which in Evelyn's experience usually meant the conditions were bad enough that whoever wrote the advertisement didn't think they could say it out loud and still get applicants. She had written a letter anyway. The response came 3 weeks later, a single sheet of paper, blunt handwriting, no pleasantries. Position available. Arrive before December or don't bother. G. Boone. She had taken it as a yes. The man sitting across from her, a heavy-set grain merchant from St. Paul, had fallen asleep with his chin on his chest and was now producing a sound somewhere between a snore and a kettle coming to boil. The woman beside Evelyn smelled of lavender and kept her eyes closed in a way that suggested she was not sleeping, but simply refusing to participate in the world. The car was warm in an unreliable way, sometimes too hot near the iron stove bolted to the forward wall, sometimes cold enough near the windows that Evelyn had tucked her fingers inside her coat sleeves. She pulled out the advertisement again. Read it for what was probably the 47th time. She thought about what she was leaving, which was, objectively, nothing. The position in Cincinnati had ended in October when the family she cooked for moved to Boston and decided they didn't need a cook for the transition period. Before that, 3 years working in a hotel kitchen in Columbus until the owner sold the property to someone who brought his own staff from back east. Before that, a brief and thoroughly miserable 6 months working for a textile manufacturer's wife who had very specific opinions about how food should taste and very little actual knowledge of food. Before that, she didn't think about before that. She was good at cooking. She had always been good at it, the way some people are simply built for a particular skill. Her hands knew how to feel when bread dough was right. Her nose could identify what a dish needed before she'd finished tasting it. In Cincinnati, the family's eldest son had told her she cooked better than any restaurant in the city. She'd thanked him and known, even as she said it, that the compliment would not translate into job security. Being good at something wasn't the same as having somewhere to put the skill. She needed somewhere to put the skill. Montana, apparently. The train conductor appeared at the end of the car, a small man with an impressive mustache and the practiced expression of someone who had delivered bad news many times and had learned to lead with it. "Bozeman's stop is 40 minutes out," he called. "Temperatures dropped considerable since this morning. If anyone's being met, advise you send word ahead. Roads are uncertain." Evelyn looked out the window. The sky had gone the color of old pewter, low and flat and serious. The kind of sky that wasn't threatening weather so much as informing you that weather had already made its decision and your opinion wasn't relevant. She hadn't sent word ahead. She hadn't known who to send it to exactly, beyond a post office box and an initial. G. Boone. She wondered what the G stood for. She wondered if he was the kind of man who went by his given name or the kind who went by something else entirely. She wondered if he was old, middle-aged, whether there was a wife, whether there were children who would need managing along with the cooking. She wondered if he had actually received her reply letter confirming her arrival date. She had not received a confirmation of his receiving her confirmation. This had seemed less catastrophic in Cincinnati. The town of Bozeman was not what she'd pictured, which was probably fair since she hadn't known exactly what to picture. It was a real town, more real than she'd expected for this far west, with proper wooden front buildings lining the main street and a hotel that looked like it had opinions about itself and several saloons that had clearly given up on opinions of any kind. The cold hit her the moment she stepped off the train platform. Not the polite cold of Ohio winter, but something with actual intention behind it. The kind of cold that went directly for the face and the ears and communicated very clearly that her coat was a suggestion rather than protection. She stood on the platform while the other passengers dispersed around her and tried to identify someone who might be here to collect her. There was nobody holding a sign. Nobody scanning the platform with the particular expression of a person waiting for an expected arrival. The grain merchant from St. Paul collected a handshake and a waiting wagon. The lavender woman found a young couple who embraced her immediately. A family of 5 became part of a larger family of 12 right there on the boards, everybody talking at once. Evelyn stood with her carpet bag and watched the platform empty out. Well, she went to find the post office. The postmaster was a thin man in his 60s with kind eyes and the unhurried manner of someone who had dealt with enough frontier emergencies that a woman arriving unmet from the train barely registered. "Boone Ranch," she said. "I'm expected there. I have a position. Do you know how I might arrange—" "Garrett Boone?" The postmaster looked up from the letter he was sorting. "I believe so, yes, G. Boone." The man set down his letters. He gave her a look she couldn't entirely read, not unkind, but thoughtful in a way that carried weight. "You the cook he advertised for?" "Yes." He sorted another letter. "You know it's about 14 miles out. I gathered it was remote. Roads not great this time of year. Not terrible yet, but not great." He paused. "Garrett doesn't come to town much. You'd need to hire a driver." "I see." She calculated. 41 cents would not hire a driver. "Is there anyone—" "My nephew takes supplies out that direction twice a month. He went out 3 days ago, so he won't be back that way until—" The postmaster looked at a calendar tacked to the wall. Late December at earliest. She had $17 remaining in her travel fund, which she had not counted as part of her 41 cents because she had intended those $17 for genuine emergencies, not planned expenditures. But she had also spent the last of her planned funds on the train ticket, and the gap between planned expenditure and genuine emergency had been quietly narrowing for the past 2 hours. "Is there anyone else who might be traveling in that direction today or tomorrow?" she asked. The postmaster thought about it. "Old Pete Halverson sometimes runs supplies out to the eastern ranches. Try the livery stable on 2nd Street. Tell him Harold sent you, he might give you a fair price." So, old Pete Halverson was not that old, perhaps 50, weathered into looking older. And he drove a supply wagon that smelled comprehensively of horse and something Evelyn decided not to identify more specifically. He had agreed to take her for $3, which she paid in a way that felt like watching water drain from a vessel with a hole in it. "You the new cook for Boone's place?" he asked as they left the edges of town behind. "Yes." She waited. He didn't add anything. "Is that a meaningful outcome?" she asked. Pete glanced at her sideways. A small smile appeared and disappeared on his weathered face. "Garrett Boone's had 3 cooks in 4 years. Last one lasted 6 weeks. Why did they leave? Man's not easy to work for." He said it without judgment, the way you'd describe weather. Not cruel, not a drunk, just— He searched for the word. Particular. Real particular about his ranch, and real particular about his privacy, and real particular about how things are done. He's got a way of making a body feel like a trespasser in a place they're supposed to be welcome. Evelyn absorbed this. What happened to the ones before? First cook was a man from back east, got homesick inside of 2 months and went back. Second one was a woman from Bozeman, capable woman too, but she had a family of her own and the distance was too much. Third one? Pete paused. Don't know exactly what happened with the third one. She just wasn't there one morning. She left without notice? That's how the story goes. Evelyn looked at the road ahead, a rutted track pushing through open country that had turned white sometime in the last hour. Snow was falling now, soft and purposeful, the kind that meant business. How far did you say it was? 14 miles, give or take. Pete clucked at the horses. Should make it before dark if the road stays passable. If. She had always been comforted by conditional statements in her life. They left room to work with. She saw the ranch buildings from about a quarter-mile out, a cluster of structures low against the hillside, brown and functional, designed by someone who cared about usefulness and cared about nothing else. A large barn, several smaller outbuildings, and the main house, a 2-story log structure with smoke coming from 2 chimneys and lamplight beginning to show in the windows as the winter afternoon folded into early dark. It looked like a place where serious things happened. Not welcoming or unwelcoming, just real in the specific way that working buildings in working country were real. No pretense to them. Pete stopped the wagon near the porch steps. You need help with your bag? He asked. I'm fine. She climbed down before he could help anyway, because she had learned that accepting help too readily sometimes looked like needing it. She knocked on the door. Nothing happened for long enough that she wondered if she'd knocked hard enough and raised her hand to try again. The door opened. The man standing in the doorway was not what she'd built in her head over the past several weeks. She'd imagined someone older, some combination of the ranchers she'd read about, bearded, heavy-set, the comfortable authority of a man settled into his property. What she got instead was a man perhaps 10 years her senior, tall in a way that was immediately apparent because he filled the doorway without quite touching either side. Dark hair. A jaw that looked like it had been set by someone who wanted it to hold. Eyes that were brown and currently doing the specific work of assessing her from head to boot without any social softening around the process. He was also, she noticed, holding a rifle. Not in a threatening way. It was pointed at the floor, carried in one hand with the casual ease of someone who had simply been walking through their house with it and hadn't thought to put it down before answering the door. But it was there, and she noted it. Mr. Boone, she said. Who are you? He said. She blinked. Evelyn Pierce, we corresponded, the cooking position. Something moved across his face. Not surprise exactly, but a recalibration. His eyes moved past her to Pete's wagon, then back to her. You're the cook, he said. Yes. You wrote from Cincinnati. That's correct. He looked at her for another moment, that same flat taking inventory look. Then he looked past her at Pete. Halverson, he said. Not a greeting. An acknowledgement. Boone, Pete touched the brim of his hat. Got your supply order in the back. And your cook. I can see that. Garrett Boone stepped back from the doorway but didn't open it wider or make any particular gesture of invitation. Bring the supplies around to the side door. He looked at Evelyn. You'd better come in, he said. It wasn't welcoming. It wasn't cold. It was simply the statement of a man who had evaluated a situation and arrived at a functional conclusion. She stepped inside. The first thing she noticed was that the house was clean but not cared for. There's a difference. And Evelyn, who had spent her adult life in other people's kitchens and houses, had learned to distinguish between them quickly. Clean meant the surfaces had been attended to, the floors swept, the obvious disorder addressed. Cared for meant someone was paying attention to the small repairs, to whether a curtain was hanging right, to whether the arrangement of the room felt like a place where a person was supposed to live. This house was clean in the way a barn is clean, functional, maintained for the purposes it needed to serve. The main room was large, a sitting area with 2 chairs pulled toward a stone fireplace, a table that could seat 8 but probably seated 3 or 4 at most, a sideboard holding a lamp and some books and nothing else. The walls were bare except for a calendar and a framed map of the territory. A rifle hung above the fireplace on 2 iron hooks. The whole room had the feeling of a place that had once been more alive and was now being operated at minimal capacity, like a mill that only runs half its wheels. Garrett set the rifle he'd been carrying against the wall near the door. She noted he placed it within reach, which was practical, and moved toward the fireplace without looking at her. "Sit," he said. "I'll get coffee." "You don't have to. It's cold and you've been on a wagon for 2 hours. Sit down." She sat. He disappeared through a doorway that she could see led to the kitchen, and she used the 30 seconds of his absence to look around more carefully. A pair of work gloves on the floor beside one of the chairs, forgotten or intentionally placed there. A mug on the hearth that had been there long enough to leave a ring. 3 books stacked on the table, their spines cracked from heavy use. One on cattle medicine, one on land surveying, one that appeared to be a novel but was face down and she couldn't read the title. He came back with 2 mugs, handed her one without ceremony, and stood with his back to the fireplace rather than sitting. This meant he was looking down at her, which might have been a power arrangement or might simply have been habit. She decided to assume habit until evidence proved otherwise. The coffee was strong and very hot, and exactly what she needed. "You're younger than I expected," he said. "I'm 23. I know. I read your letter." He drank his coffee. "You said you had 8 years cooking experience." "I do. I started at 15 in my aunt's boarding house." "That's not the same as running a ranch kitchen." "I know it's not," she said, "but I learn fast and I work hard, and the skills translate more than most people assume." He made a sound that was not quite agreement and not quite dismissal. "The men eat a lot. I have 6 hands right now, and they work long hours in this cold. Breakfast at 5, dinner at noon if they come in, supper at 6. That's the schedule. I can manage that. Baking, too. They go through bread fast. I can bake? The kitchen needs organizing. Previous cook left it in poor shape. I'm good at organizing." He looked at her steadily. "You have a fast answer for everything." "I have a direct answer for everything," she said. "That's not the same as a fast one." Something shifted in his expression, not warmly, but with a quality of slight recalibration, like she'd said something he hadn't expected. "The room at the back of the house is yours," he said. "You'll have privacy, but understand that this is a working ranch. The men don't have cause to come to that end of the house, and I'd like to keep it that way." "That's fine. I'll want you to start tomorrow morning, 5 o'clock. "Of course." He looked at her one more time, that flat, measuring look, and then nodded once, which she understood to be the conclusion of the interview portion of the evening. "I'll show you the kitchen," he said. The kitchen was large for a ranch house. Someone had thought about it when they built this place, had understood that the kitchen was the engine and built the engine room to match. A long iron range along the rear wall with 8 burners and 2 oven doors. Counter space on either side. A heavy work table in the center. Dry goods shelves along the left wall. A cold pantry beyond a second door. Hooks for pots and utensils over the range. It was also, she saw immediately, a disaster. Not filthy. Someone had made gestures toward cleaning. But whoever the previous cook had been, and however they had functioned, they had apparently operated entirely without system. Dry goods containers were in no particular order. Spices had been placed with no apparent logic. Cinnamon beside salt. Dried herbs mixed with baking supplies. The pots were stacked wrong. The knives were stored incorrectly and would be dulling against each other. There were what appeared to be 4 separate containers of lard in different stages of use instead of one properly managed supply. Evelyn looked at it for a long moment. "I see," she said. "It functions," Garrett said, and something in his voice suggested he was aware this was not a rousing endorsement. "It will function better." She set her carpet bag down by the door and walked to the shelves, not touching anything yet, but reading them the way she always read a new kitchen. Taking inventory. "What do you currently have in the cold pantry?" "Salt pork, some venison, salted, root vegetables, butter, eggs." "What was ordered from Bozeman tonight?" He listed the supplies Pete had brought. Flour, sugar, dried beans, more salt pork, coffee, some other staples. It was adequate for winter cooking. Not generous, but adequate. "All right," she said. "All right what?" "All right. I understand what I'm working with." He watched her for a moment. She got the sense he wasn't accustomed to people taking the measure of a situation and simply accepting it without complaint or commentary. "Supper tonight is already done," he said. "Men are eating in the bunkhouse. You don't need to worry about it tonight." "I'm not worried about it." She turned to look at him. "What time is breakfast?" 5 o'clock. "Then I'll be up at 4:30. Something happened around the edges of his eyes. Not quite approval, not quite surprise, something between the two. "Sleep well, Miss Pierce," he said, and left her to her kitchen. Her room was small and cold and plain, a bed with a reasonable mattress, a washstand, a window that looked out at the dark hillside behind the house, a hook on the wall, and a small dresser with a cracked mirror above it. There was one lamp and an adequate supply of matches. She sat on the edge of the bed and allowed herself 30 seconds to simply feel how tired she was. 3 days on the train. The cold. The wagon ride. The assessment of a man who seemed to have made a preliminary judgment of insufficient and was keeping that verdict on hand in case he needed it. Then she stood up, unpacked her bag, hung her second dress on the hook, placed her work boots by the door, and got into bed. She lay in the dark, listening to the wind pick up outside, and thought about the kitchen and what she would cook in the morning. She had discovered through years of working in other people's houses that if you could get someone's practical opinion of you squared away first, if they saw you were competent and reliable and produced results, everything else became easier to navigate. The men needed feeding. She could feed them. Everything after that was secondary. She fell asleep thinking about bread, 4 to 25. She woke before the alarm she'd set in her head, which she could always do and didn't fully understand. The room was dark and cold enough that her breath made shapes. She dressed quickly, layered her coat over her work dress, and went to the kitchen. She built up the fire in the range first. The coals were banked and it caught without difficulty. While it heated, she reorganized the dry goods shelves with the quiet efficiency of someone who had done this particular task in dozens of different kitchens. Everything in order, everything where it made sense to be. The knives she sharpened properly on the whetstone she found in a drawer. She made biscuits from scratch. She fried salt pork until it was properly done, not rushed. She made a pan of scrambled eggs with what she had available and boiled a pot of oatmeal because in cold weather, men always ate more oatmeal than they thought they would. She made coffee strong enough to mean something. By 5 o'clock, the kitchen smelled the way kitchens were supposed to smell. The men came in from the bunkhouse in stages, stomping snow off their boots at the door, faces raw from the cold outside. 6 of them. She'd learn names over the next few days, but this morning she noted types. The big one with the blonde beard, who came in first and immediately looked for the coffee. The younger one, barely more than a boy, who appeared to be trying to grow a mustache and not quite achieving it. The 2 middle-aged men who moved with the unhurried competence of people who had been doing exactly this work for 20 years. A quiet man who sat in the same spot without being asked, as though he'd chosen it years ago. And the foreman, she identified him by how the others deferred to him, a lean man of perhaps 45 with deliberate eyes and a way of sitting that suggested he rarely did things without a reason. None of them spoke to her directly. This was not unusual. She served them. She refilled coffee before they had to ask. She put the biscuits out and watched 3 of them disappear in about 90 seconds. The big blonde one said "Lord above" under his breath when he bit into a biscuit. He wasn't talking to her, but she heard it. Garrett came in last. He sat at the head of the table. The only chair at the head, she noticed, the only one slightly different from the others. And she poured his coffee before he asked. He looked at the food on the table. He looked at her. He ate without commenting. At the end of breakfast, the foreman, she'd learned his name was Hank Burgess, looked at her and said, "Good biscuits, ma'am," in a straightforward way that communicated he was not the type to say it if he didn't mean it. "Thank you," she said. After they'd all gone out, she cleared the dishes, washed them, and began planning dinner. This was how it started. The first week had a quality of provisional peace to it. The men warmed to her faster than she expected. Or rather, not warmed exactly, because warmth took time, but they accepted her in the way working people accept someone who does their job well and doesn't create problems. She learned their names and preferences. The big blonde one was Carl Dumont, originally from Minnesota, who ate twice what anyone else ate and was embarrassed about it in a way that was almost endearing. The young one with the aspiring mustache was Tommy Reeves, 19 years old, who had come west from Nebraska looking for something he couldn't quite name. Hank Burgess had been Garrett's foreman for 11 years. The quiet man was Ezra Fell, who she gradually realized was the most competent person on the property after Garrett himself, and who expressed his opinions entirely through the degree of attention he gave things. Garrett she could not read. He was not unpleasant. He was not aggressive. He ate what she cooked without complaint, and occasionally with something that might have been appreciation but was expressed so minimally it could have been anything. He said good morning when he came into the kitchen and good night when the day was done, and those were often the most words they exchanged directly. But she caught him watching her sometimes. Not in any unsettling way. Not that kind of watching. More like she was a variable in an equation he hadn't yet resolved. Like he hadn't quite decided what category to put her in, and was keeping the question open while he gathered more information. One evening, at the end of the first week, she was still in the kitchen after supper, reorganizing the pantry by lamplight. There were things she hadn't gotten to yet, things that could be done better, when she heard him come in from outside. The stamp of his boots, the sound of a coat being hung. He appeared in the kitchen doorway. "You're still working," he said, "just reorganizing the cold pantry. You don't need to do that tonight." "I know. I want to." She moved a jar to a better position. "It bothers me when I know things are out of order." He leaned against the door frame. She could feel him looking at her. "Miss Pierce." "Yes?" "Why did you take this position?" She turned from the pantry and looked at him. He was asking directly, which was his way. She was learning. No decoration around the point. "Because I needed work and this was available," she said. "There must have been work closer to Cincinnati. I'd used up what was available to me there." He considered this. "You have no family?" "No." She said it the way she'd learned to say it, plainly, without the inflection that invited follow-up questions. "My mother died when I was 17, my father before that. I have no siblings. I'm on my own, which is fine. Most people are in one way or another." He was quiet for a moment. Something moved through his expression that she couldn't identify. "The advertisement didn't say much," he said finally. "No. It didn't say much because I didn't think I'd get applicants who'd actually come this far. Yet here I am. Yet here you are." A pause. "You did good work this week." It wasn't effusive. It wasn't generous. It was offered the way he offered everything. Economically, because he only said what he actually meant. "Thank you," she said. He pushed off the door frame. "Lock the cold pantry when you're done. The latch on that door sticks." "I know. I fixed it this afternoon." He stopped. "You fixed the latch." "It just needed the hinge adjusted. I found a screwdriver in the bottom drawer." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't fully read. Something with edges to it, almost like he'd been caught off guard by something small. "Good night, Miss Pierce," he said. "Good night, Mr. Boone." He left. She finished with the pantry. The latch closed cleanly when she pulled the door shut. Outside, the wind had been picking up for 3 days. On the 8th day, Hank Burgess looked at the sky at noon and said to nobody in particular, "That's not a normal sky." It wasn't. Evelyn had been watching it all morning, a color she couldn't name precisely, not gray and not white, but something between the two that had a yellowish undertone, like old ivory. The clouds were low and moving fast despite the fact that down at ground level, the air was almost completely still. That stillness itself was wrong. November in Montana should have had wind. The absence of wind felt like a held breath. She was in the kitchen after the noon meal when Garrett came in with Hank, both of them moving with the particular energy of people who have shifted from regular operations to something that required decisions. "Storm?" she heard Hank say. "Storm," Garrett said. It wasn't a question. "Big one?" "Don't know yet. Possible." He moved to the window over the sink and stood there looking out. "Get the cattle moved to the lower pasture before dark. If this breaks the way I think it might, the upper range will be inaccessible." "Already on it." Hank went out. Garrett stayed at the window a moment. "Miss Pierce," he said, without turning. "Yes?" "What are your supplies like?" She had just taken inventory 2 days ago. 3 weeks of staples at minimum, if I'm careful. Possibly 4. The root cellar has good stores. "Good." He turned from the window. "If this is what I think it is, we may be confined to the ranch for some time. A week. Could be longer." "I understand." "Are you—" He stopped. Something went across his face, like he'd started a sentence in his head and found it didn't come out right. "You could ride back to Bozeman today if you wanted to, before it comes in." She looked at him. He wasn't trying to get rid of her. She could tell the difference. He was offering an out, clumsily, because he was not a man accustomed to offering outs or worrying whether someone had been adequately warned about what they were walking into. "I'll stay," she said. "The storms here are different than—" "Mr. Boone," she met his eyes directly. "I'll stay?" He held her gaze for a moment. "All right," he said. He went out. She went back to her kitchen. She began pulling supplies to the front of the pantry where they'd be easy to access, and then she started baking bread, because if a storm was coming, the right thing to do was have bread. Outside, the yellow ivory sky settled lower toward the earth, and the stillness deepened, and the first flakes came in the evening, small and dry and very fast, coming nearly sideways. And by the time supper was cleared away, the world outside the windows had disappeared entirely. The men were still in the bunkhouse when it truly started. She'd sent extra food out with Tommy at 6, more than usual, extra coffee, the last of that day's bread. And Tommy had looked at the sky walking back and said, "Holy," and then remembered himself. Garrett had the ranch on storm procedure by nightfall, the horses brought into the barn, the hay stocks checked, the water barrels in the bunkhouse filled. She watched some of this from the kitchen window, the lamplight making the snow visible in a tunnel of yellow against the dark, and thought about logistics. How many days of serious confinement? What could be cooked with what they had? How to manage fuel for the range? It was not until nearly 8 o'clock that she heard a sound she couldn't identify from the far end of the house. She went to look. Garrett was in the main room moving furniture. Not dramatically. He'd shifted one of the chairs slightly and appeared to be examining the window frame near the south wall, running his hand along the edge where the frame met the log wall. "Draft," he said, without looking up. "From the window? This one's always had a gap. Plugged it last year, but the caulking didn't hold." He produced something from his coat pocket, a strip of cloth, it looked like, and pressed it into the gap. "In a real storm, it loses heat fast through here." She watched him work. His hands were capable in the way of someone who had fixed everything in this house at one point or another, who knew every fault and weakness of it the way you know the faults and weaknesses of something you've lived with for a long time. "How old is the house?" she asked. 12 years? "I built it." He pressed the cloth into the gap and held it. "First structure on this property. Started with just this." She hadn't known that. "Just you?" "Me and 2 hands I hired for that first summer." He checked the window. The gap was sealed for now. "Most of what you see out there, barn, outbuildings, came after. Took about 4 years to get it where it is." She tried to picture it. 20-something years old out here building this from the ground. "That's a significant undertaking," she said. "Had reasons to work hard." He said it simply, like a fact about the weather. "What reasons?" He looked at her then, a flat, considering look. "You ask a lot of questions, Miss Pierce." "You said you expected a cook," she said, "not a wall." The corner of his mouth moved. It wasn't quite a smile. It was the smallest possible gesture in the direction of one. "Go to bed," he said. "It'll be a long morning." She went to bed. The storm howled all night with a sound like something very large and a great deal of pain, and in the morning the world outside had changed entirely. White, deep, complete, as though the winter had decided to make a definitive statement. She was up at 4:15. She built the fire and began making breakfast, and when the men came in, stamping snow 3 feet deep from their boots, their faces raw and their voices muted by the sheer fact of the weather, she had everything ready. Carl Dumont sat down, wrapped his enormous hands around a coffee mug, and said, "Thank God," with a feeling that suggested he meant it. Garrett came in last, as always. He looked at her across the kitchen. "Still here," he said. "I told you I would be," she said. He sat down. Outside, the storm continued its declaration, and inside the ranch house, in the kitchen that smelled of coffee and biscuits and wood smoke, something that had been cold and still for a very long time began, almost imperceptibly, to shift. The storm lasted 4 days. Not 4 days of polite snowfall that accumulated gradually and gave people time to adjust. 4 days of the kind of weather that reminded you the continent hadn't particularly been designed with human habitation in mind. Wind that came in at angles that made no physical sense, temperatures that dropped so fast you could almost hear them falling, snow that didn't so much drift as assault. By the second morning, there were drifts against the north wall of the house that reached the lower edge of the first-floor windows. The bunkhouse door had to be dug out from the inside. The path between the house and the barn, which Garrett and Hank had roped in anticipation, a rope line so that no one navigated blind in a whiteout, had to be maintained every 4 hours or it disappeared entirely under new accumulation. Evelyn watched all of this from whatever window happened to be nearest and kept cooking. This was not a passive decision. When the world outside becomes genuinely dangerous and there's nothing useful you can contribute to the outside work, the most effective thing you can do is make sure the inside work is done so completely and reliably that everyone who comes in from the cold doesn't have to think about anything except getting warm. She understood this the way she understood most practical things, not as a philosophy, but as a simple logic. The men needed to eat more in this cold, not less. Their bodies were burning fuel just staying warm while they worked. She adjusted accordingly. Breakfast got bigger. She started adding boiled oats alongside the biscuits, fried salt pork and eggs when she had them, corn porridge when she didn't. She kept coffee on the range all day, hot enough to mean something when somebody came in half frozen at noon. For supper, she made the kinds of things that held heat and weight. Bean soup thick enough to stand a spoon in, salt pork braised with root vegetables until the whole thing became something more than the sum of its parts, cornbread baked in the Dutch oven when the regular oven was already in use. Carl Dumont, on the second day, ate 2 full bowls of the bean soup and then sat back in his chair and looked at her with the specific expression of a man who has been eating purely for sustenance for so long that he'd forgotten food could be something other than that. "Miss Pierce," he said, "where did you learn to cook like this?" "Practice," she said. She was already clearing the other end of the table. "My mother couldn't cook like this, and she practiced every day for 40 years. Then she was practicing the wrong things." Tommy Reeves snorted into his coffee. Carl looked mildly offended and then decided she was probably right. Hank Burgess said nothing, but she noticed he took a second piece of cornbread, which from Hank communicated more than a speech would have. Garrett ate and didn't comment. But his bowl was empty, which she had learned to read accurately by the third day. He ate everything she put in front of him, and he ate it without leaving anything behind, which was its own form of statement from a man who chose his statements carefully. On the third day, the wind dropped slightly, not gone, but reduced from its most aggressive register, and Garrett and 2 of the hands went out to check on the cattle in the lower pasture. They were gone for 3 hours. When they came back, Garrett's face was the particular color of someone who has been genuinely cold for an extended period, a kind of deep red that had nothing to do with warmth, and his hands, when he pulled off his gloves at the door, were shaking in a controlled way that suggested he was controlling them deliberately. She had coffee ready because she'd heard them coming, had heard the specific sound of the barn door. She handed him the mug when he came through the kitchen and didn't say anything about his hands. He looked at the mug. He looked at her. "Thank you," he said, and it came out with slightly less armor than his usual thanks. The cold had gotten into the performance of him, she thought, and let something more direct through. "Cattle?" she asked. "Holding." He wrapped both hands around the mug. "Lost 2 to the cold in the upper range before we got them moved. Could have been worse. I'm sorry about the 2. He nodded once. Something in his face acknowledged the condolence without making anything of it. He was the kind of man who absorbed losses and moved on because the alternative was sitting still, and sitting still didn't save anything. But the 2 counted. She could see that they counted even when his face was working to neutralize the information. That evening, she made something she hadn't planned. A dried apple cake, using the last of the dried apples from the pantry and some of the sugar and cinnamon. It wasn't strictly necessary. It was, in terms of pure resource management, probably not the most efficient use of supplies. But she made it anyway, and when she put it on the table after supper, the men went quiet, in the specific way of people encountering something unexpected. Ezra Fell, who had spoken perhaps 12 words to her in 3 days, looked at the cake and then at her and said, in a way that she somehow knew was the highest compliment he had available. Tommy said, "Oh, that's not fair," with a feeling that made Carl laugh. Garrett looked at it. He looked at her. He didn't say anything. He ate a piece. He ate it slowly, which from him was a notable gesture, because he usually ate with the focused efficiency of a man who considered the meal a task to be completed. She didn't make anything of it. She cleared the rest of the table and let them have the small moment of sweetness in the middle of the hard, cold days, which was why she'd made it. By the fourth morning, the storm had exhausted itself. As storms eventually do, they spend themselves and leave behind a silence so complete it's almost loud. Evelyn opened the kitchen door at 4:30 and stood in the doorway for a moment, looking out at a world that had been restructured from the ground up. The snow was deep and blue in the pre-dawn dark, and the air was so cold and clear it felt like something you were breaking when you breathed it. She went back inside and started breakfast. Outside, she could hear the ranch coming back to life. Voices, the sound of shovels on frozen ground, the cattle making their low complaints from the direction of the lower pasture. They'd come through it. It was only later, washing dishes in the quiet after the men had gone back to their work, that she allowed herself to feel relieved. The storm had passed. She was still here, and nobody had tried to send her away. That was not nothing. The days that followed had a different texture to them. The enforced proximity of the storm had altered the social geometry of the ranch in ways that were subtle but real. The men had spent 4 days in closer quarters than usual, had shared meals with more dependence on the person providing them than in normal operations, and had come out the other side with a collective adjustment in how they related to her. Carl stopped looking for things to do with his hands when he talked to her and just talked to her. Tommy had started helping carry things without being asked, not in an obsequious way, just the easy helpfulness of someone who has decided you belong in the space you occupy. Ezra continued to communicate primarily through monosyllables and sustained silences, but she'd realized by now that his silences around her had a different quality than his silences around things he disapproved of. Hank Burgess remained formally polite in all the ways that counted, but she caught him defending the organization of the kitchen to one of the newer hands who'd come looking for something in the wrong drawer. "It's organized," Hank said in a tone that settled the matter. The new hand, whose name she'd learned was Pete Voss, different Pete from Halverson, said, "It's not how it used to be." And Hank said, "No," in a way that clearly meant, "Which is the point?" She pretended she hadn't heard any of this. What the ranch hands thought of her and what Garrett Boone thought of her were two separate equations, and she was making good progress on one while the other remained essentially opaque. He wasn't cold to her. She'd adjusted her initial read of him over the first 2 weeks. He wasn't cold exactly, cold being a temperature and what he was being more of a deliberate containment. Like a man who had decided that the range of things he let himself express had a hard outer boundary, and he was very practiced at maintaining it. He was fair. He worked harder than any of his hands and expected them to know that. He solved problems directly and didn't waste energy on grievances. He didn't drink more than moderately, and he didn't play at cruelty. But he also didn't let anything in without apparent effort. She'd started to notice the specific ways the house showed his solitude. Not the dust and disorganization. Those were just the result of a man who was too busy and too alone to maintain things. But the other details. The novel on the table that she'd never seen him read, face down as though he'd been interrupted months ago and hadn't gotten back to it. The second coffee cup that hung on the far hook in the kitchen, different from the others, nicer, with a small painted pattern on it, that was never used and never moved. A framed photograph on the high shelf in the main room, turned slightly toward the wall, not quite facing out but not hidden. She had not asked about any of these things. About 2.5 weeks into her time at the ranch, she was reorganizing the top shelves of the main room, dusting them, which nobody had done for a very long time given the quantity of dust involved, when she accidentally shifted the photograph and saw it properly for the first time. A woman, young, maybe 20, with dark hair dressed neatly and the kind of clear, direct gaze that photographs of that era rarely captured, because sitting still long enough for an exposure usually produced an expression of careful neutrality. But this one had caught something in her, a quality of being present, of looking at whoever was behind the camera with actual intention. She replaced it carefully in its original position, slightly angled toward the wall. That evening, without a planning to, she found herself thinking about what Pete Halverson had said on the wagon ride in. 3 cooks in 4 years. Man's not easy to work for. She thought about the house that was clean but not cared for. The second cup. The photograph. She thought about loss, which she knew something about, and about how people built structures around it. Habits and distances and routines that were really walls they'd stopped seeing as walls because they'd been living inside them long enough. She understood that. She was not naive enough to think understanding it meant anything useful, but she understood it. The following Tuesday, she was keeping track of days by now with the small calendar she'd found in the kitchen drawer. She was in the middle of bread making when Garrett came in at an unusual hour, mid-afternoon, when he was normally out with the cattle. He looked like he'd been somewhere in his head. There was a quality of distance about him that she recognized as something different from his usual containment, less deliberate, more like he'd gotten lost somewhere inside himself and was finding his way back. She was kneading bread dough, and she did not stop kneading it. He poured himself coffee and stood at the window that looked out at the south pasture. "Losing those 2 cattle," he said, after a long pause. "The count before winter is supposed to account for losses. The numbers still don't balance the way I need them to." She kept her hands in the dough. "What would balance them?" "2 more come spring, market price for the shortfall." He drank his coffee. "It's manageable, just not where I wanted to be." "How many head total?" 212 now. Was it 250 when the season started, but we sold a good portion in October." He was talking in the direction of the window, not at her, which seemed to make it easier for him. "First few years, I had 30 head. 30 head, and this house, and the barn, and 2 men who probably should have quit and gone somewhere more sensible. Why didn't they? Hank's not sensible. Ezra doesn't have anywhere else to be." A beat. "I was paying them well enough." She could hear in the way he said this last part that it was not the whole reason, and he knew it wasn't the whole reason, and he wasn't interested in elaborating. "You built something real," she said. "Still building." He turned from the window. He looked at her hands in the dough. "You do that every day." "Bread?" "Yes, you go through it quickly." "I noticed." A pause. "The men talk about your cooking." "In what sense?" "In the sense that it comes up in conversation when people usually talk about cattle and weather and equipment." He said it as though this was slightly puzzling to him. "Carl told me it was the best food he'd had since his mother's kitchen. Carl's mother died in 1879. She pushed the heels of her hands into the dough. "I hope that's meant as a compliment. From Carl, it's a biblical statement." The corner of his mouth moved. "That small, reluctant thing. He told me if I let you leave, he'd go with you." She looked up. He was watching her with that steady, unreadable look, but there was something slightly different in it now, less evaluation, more like he was simply looking. "Are you planning to let me leave?" she asked. "That depends," he said. "On what?" "On whether you're planning to." She held his gaze. Outside, the cold afternoon wind moved across the pasture, bending the dry grass that showed above the snow in long, slow waves. "I came here for the winter," she said carefully. "That's what was offered." "I'm aware." He set down his coffee mug. "I'm asking what you want." She wasn't accustomed to being asked what she wanted. People offered her positions or didn't. They told her the terms. She accepted or declined. The question of what she wanted sat strangely in her chest, like furniture moved to an unexpected location in a familiar room. "I want to do the job I came to do," she said finally. "Past that, I don't know yet." He nodded, not satisfied exactly, but accepting. "Fair enough." He took his coffee and went back out, and she returned to her bread, pressing and folding with more force than strictly necessary, while she sorted out why the conversation had unsettled her, and reached the conclusion that it was because he'd asked her a genuine question and waited for a genuine answer, which was rarer than it had any right to be. The bread came out good that day, dense and even, with a crust that cracked right when you broke it. She set the loaves to cool on the counter and stood looking at them for a minute, then went to check the cold pantry inventory. There were practical things to attend to. There were always practical things to attend to. It was easier that way. The next difficulty arrived not from the weather, but from one of the hands. Pete Voss, the newer one, who had a quality of permanent dissatisfaction that Evelyn had noted in her first week and filed under manageable unless otherwise indicated. He was competent at his work, as far as she could tell, and he wasn't openly difficult in any way she could point to, but he had a habit of speaking to her in a tone that was technically polite and actually dismissive, the way some men spoke to women they'd decided occupied a subordinate category and didn't need to be addressed as people with views. On a Thursday, towards the end of her third week, she had just finished setting up for supper when Voss came in early from the pasture, before the other hands, and helped himself to coffee and sat at the table without asking. This was fine. The men came in when they came in. "What's for supper?" he asked. Bean and salt pork, cornbread. He made a sound that was technically nothing and communicated clearly. Again? She was slicing the cornbread. She kept slicing. The weather limits what's available. Seems like a good cook could do more with what's available. She set down the knife. She turned and looked at him directly. If you have suggestions, she said, I'm happy to hear them. Otherwise, supper's at 6. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite backing down, but recalculating. He was the type, she'd learned, who tested limits sideways rather than head-on, seeing where the boundary was. Just making conversation, he said. Then find a different topic, she said pleasantly, and picked up her knife. He left before the other men came in. He came back for supper and ate 2 bowls of the bean and salt pork and didn't comment on any of it, which was as close to an apology as she suspected he came. She didn't mention it to anyone. But she noticed the next day that Hank Burgess had a conversation with Voss outside the barn that involved Hank doing most of the talking and Voss doing none of it, and nodding in the specific way of someone absorbing information they would rather not. She didn't know what was said. She knew that the following day, and each day after, Voss was scrupulously neutral toward her in all observable ways. Hank Burgess, she decided, was one of the more valuable people she'd encountered in her working life, precisely because he handled things without drama and expected no acknowledgement for it. She thanked him by making sure his coffee was always hot, because she understood that some forms of gratitude were best expressed practically. It was Ezra Fell who finally said the thing that no one had said out loud yet, which was somehow appropriate because Ezra never said anything until he was ready to say exactly the thing that needed saying. It was a quiet Sunday, the only morning the men came in later than usual, and she was sitting at the kitchen work table with a cup of coffee and her small notebook where she kept recipes and supply lists and the occasional thought she didn't want to lose. Ezra came in alone, which almost never happened. He moved with the others the way tide moves with tide. He poured coffee. He sat across from her at the work table without asking, which he had never done before. She looked up. This place was bad before you came, he said. She waited. Not bad, not dangerous. Just. He looked into his coffee. Ezra Fell was a man of 60-something, she thought, though it was hard to know exactly. His face had the particular carving of someone who had spent 40 years outdoors. Empty. Even with all of us here. Still empty. How long has Mr. Boone been running this ranch alone, she asked. Running it alone always. A pause. But there was someone here for a while, few years back, made a difference. He drank his coffee. Didn't elaborate. She didn't ask him to. I'm glad to be here, she said, which was the most honest thing she could say. Ezra nodded once. He finished his coffee, stood up, set the mug in the wash basin with a care that seemed disproportionate to the gesture and might have been something else entirely, and went out. She sat with her notebook for another few minutes, and then got up to start breakfast. Outside, December had arrived in full. The sky was the particular shade of gray that meant more snow before the week was out. The cattle moved slowly in the lower pasture, visible as dark shapes against the white ground. The barn needed a new hinge on the south door, which Carl had mentioned and which hadn't been fixed yet. The woodpile on the north side of the house needed to be restacked after the storm had unsettled it. Evelyn added the woodpile to her mental list. She'd ask Tommy to help her after the morning work was done. Tommy would say yes because Tommy always said yes to tasks she gave him, partly because he was generally helpful, and partly because she suspected he was mildly lonely in the specific way of very young men who are working too hard to acknowledge it. She would make sure to make something good for supper, not because she was trying to prove anything anymore. That phase had lasted perhaps a week, but because it was her work and she did her work well, because this cold, hard, half-broken place had let her in, and whatever complicated thing was being built here, brick by difficult brick, she was part of it now. She cracked the eggs for breakfast and the yolks ran gold in the lamplight, and outside the first snow of December began to fall, soft and serious, the way the sky up here always meant what it said. The second week of December arrived with a deceptive quiet that Hank Burgess didn't trust for a single hour of it. Sky's too clear, he said on the Monday morning, standing outside the barn with his coffee, looking north. This time of year, sky shouldn't be that clear. Evelyn had heard him say it from the kitchen doorway where she'd stepped out to shake a flour sack, and she'd looked at the sky herself, blue, hard, almost metallic, the kind of blue that had no softness in it, and thought he was probably right. She'd been in Montana long enough now, barely a month but an educational month, to understand that the land up here communicated its intentions in advance if you knew the language. Garrett had heard Hank, too. She'd seen it in the way he'd paused on his way to the barn, looked up at the same sky, and then kept walking without saying anything, which was itself a kind of statement. The week proceeded normally enough on the surface. The cattle needed daily tending in the cold, the fences required checking after the previous storm's damage. There was equipment to repair and hay to move and the 1,000 small maintenance tasks that a working ranch generated constantly, like a machine that produced its own friction. Evelyn cooked and managed the kitchen and had learned by now to have extra food ready on days when the men came in later than expected, which was most days. She and Garrett had settled into a pattern that was neither friendship nor its absence, something more functional than that, more specific. They talked about the ranch, about supplies, about what the men needed, about the practical geography of the next week's work. Sometimes he'd come into the kitchen in the evening and drink coffee and say something that wasn't quite ranch business and wasn't quite personal conversation, but existed somewhere in the territory between them, and she'd respond in kind, and they'd exist in the same room for 20 minutes without it being uncomfortable. This was more than she'd expected when she arrived. She tried not to think too hard about what she expected now. On Thursday evening, Garrett spread a map on the kitchen table after supper while she was finishing the washing up. She'd learned not to leave the kitchen when he did this. He wasn't asking her to go, and the kitchen was as much her space as any room in the house by this point, arguably more so. Upper range, he said, not really to her, running his finger along a line on the map. If this cold holds, the creek on the north side is going to freeze solid by the weekend. Cattle can't drink from it once it does. Can they be moved before then? That's the question. He leaned over the map. His shirt was rolled to the elbows despite the cold, the way it always was when he was working through a problem. Moving them now means pushing them through the gap in the ridge and cold that's only going to get worse. Waiting means the water access problem. What does Hank think? Garrett looked up. It still caught him slightly, she'd noticed, when she asked about operational decisions. Not irritated. More like he hadn't expected the question to be relevant to her and was adjusting to the fact that it apparently was. Hank thinks we move them Friday. Get it done before the weekend. He looked back at the map. I think he's right. Then why are you still looking at the map? A pause. Because the sky concerns me. She came to stand at the other side of the table, close enough to see the map properly. It was detailed, handmade in places she could see, sections of it in different handwriting, added over years. The Boone Ranch property and everything around it, every ridge and creek and pasture, labeled with the kind of intimacy that only came from having walked every inch of it. What does the sky say that Hank's plan doesn't account for? She asked. He looked at her across the map. That we might not have until Friday. She looked at the map. She looked at him. Then you should go tomorrow, she said. He was quiet for a moment. It's a full day's ride up to the upper range and back. In this cold, pushing cattle through that gap, we'd need at least 4 hands, probably all day and into the evening. I'll have food ready when you come back. She said it simply because it was the simple truth of it, whatever time that is. He held her gaze. Something in his face did that thing she'd noticed. That very small shift that happened when she said something direct that he hadn't anticipated. All right, he said. He rolled up the map. She went back to the washing up. Neither of them said anything else, but when she heard him on the stairs going up to bed, she found herself looking at the north-facing window above the sink and thinking about that metallic blue sky and hoping she was wrong about what it meant. She was not wrong. She knew it when she woke at 4 in the morning and heard the wind. Not the wind of a normal cold night, but something with a different register to it, lower, more sustained, the kind of sound a very large thing makes when it is moving with intention. She dressed and went to the kitchen and built up the range fire and looked out the window and saw nothing. Just the darkness, which told her the stars were gone, which told her the clouds had moved in overnight while everyone slept. By the time Garrett came downstairs at 4:30, she had breakfast almost ready and a look on her face that she suspected communicated what she'd seen outside. He went to the window without speaking, looked out, came back. It's moving faster than I thought, he said. Yes. We still need to move those cattle. I know. If we leave them up there and this comes in hard, I know, Garrett. It was the first time she'd used his given name out loud, and she heard herself do it and didn't take it back. Go. Take what you need. I'll manage here. He looked at her for a moment, that direct taking stock look, and then nodded once and went to get the men up. Breakfast was fast and largely silent, the way meals were when serious work was ahead. Carl ate with his usual appetite, but without the usual accompanying conversation. Tommy was quieter than she'd ever seen him, his eyes carrying the specific alertness of youth encountering real danger and deciding what to do with that information. Hank ate methodically, already half in the work ahead. Ezra drank 2 cups of coffee and said nothing. Garrett ate standing up, which he only did when he was ready to be somewhere else. She packed them food to take, cornbread wrapped in cloth, jerky, a flask of coffee for each of them. When she handed Garrett his, their hands didn't quite touch, but almost did. And he looked at her with an expression she couldn't read but felt the weight of. Keep the fires going, he said. Yes. Don't go outside unless you have to. I wasn't planning to. And if it gets bad... He stopped himself, looked at her. The root cellar door is the inside one, off the back room, latch on the outside. I know where it is. I'm just... He stopped again. The word sane hung in the air unfinished. I know, she said. Go. They went. She stood in the kitchen doorway and watched them ride out in the first thin gray light of morning, 6 horses moving into a landscape that was already changing. The wind picking up, the clouds pushing south at a speed that made the sky look like a thing actively running towards something. She closed the door and went back to work. The morning passed in the way that mornings pass when you are waiting without wanting to admit you're waiting. She cleaned, she organized, she baked. 2 full batches of bread, a pot of soup set to simmer low all day, a pan of corn cake that she made partly because it needed making and partly because doing something with her hands kept her from standing at the window too frequently. By noon, the snow had started. Small at first, then not small. By 2 in the afternoon, she could not see the barn from the kitchen window. She fed the fire. She checked the root cellar latch. It worked fine. It had always worked fine. She had checked it in the first week out of pure practical habit. She filled 2 extra water buckets and brought them inside. She pulled extra wood from the pile on the porch before the porch became inaccessible and stacked it inside the back room where it would stay dry. She made herself eat something at noon, not because she was hungry, but because she was not going to be the person who forgot to take care of herself while taking care of everything else, which was a trap she had watched other women fall into and had decided young she would not. At 3 o'clock, she heard the sound she'd been trying not to listen for. A voice outside, then another, then the unmistakable heavy movement of horses near the barn. She put on her coat and opened the kitchen door. The cold hit her like a physical force. The snow was coming sideways now, the wind behind it mean and serious. She could see shapes, moving, dark against the white, and she could see they were coming in wrong, not in the organized way of men returning from a completed job. The movement was off, slower than it should be. Someone was being helped. She grabbed the rope on the porch post. Garrett had strung it between the house and the barn in the first days of her arrival. She'd thought it unnecessary then, and she went out into it, following the rope hand over hand into the white blindness, until she met them halfway. Garrett was the one guiding the group back. She found that out later. He'd been at the rear, pushing, making sure everyone kept moving. What she found first was Carl, enormous Carl Dumont, moving with a heaviness in his left leg that wasn't normal, assisted on one side by Tommy, who was shaking with cold so thoroughly she could see it even in the limited visibility. I've got him, she said to Tommy. I've got him. Let go. His leg? I see it. Let go, Tommy. I've got him. She took Carl's arm over her shoulders, which was a significant undertaking given the difference in their sizes, and she moved them toward the rope and along it toward the house. Behind her, she could hear the others coming. The cattle were a sound in the far distance. They'd made it to somewhere. She'd learn later it was the middle pasture, close enough to the barn to be manageable. She got Carl inside, Tommy behind him, then Ezra, moving stiffly but under his own power, then Hank, who had a look on his face she'd never seen there before, the look of someone who had run very long on something that was now running out. She waited. Garrett came through the door last, alone. The cold had gotten to him in a different way than the others. Not his extremities, not primarily. He'd been moving too hard for his hands and feet to fail him. It had gotten into him somewhere deeper, the specific exhaustion of a man who has been responsible for other people's survival for 8 straight hours in conditions that were trying to kill all of them, and has delivered on that responsibility and has nothing left. He stopped inside his door and just stood there for a moment, dripping snow, not moving. She went to him. She pulled his coat from his shoulders. He let her, which told her everything about how tired he was, and hung it by the door. She pressed a mug of coffee into his hands. She said nothing. He looked at her. His eyes were exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. "Carl's leg?" he said. "I'm looking at it now. Sit down." "The cattle made it to—" "I know. I'll hear all of it. Sit down first." He sat down at the kitchen table. He put both hands around the coffee mug and bent his head over it. She went to Carl, who was in the main room by the fire with his boot off, Tommy kneeling beside him, looking worried. Carl's ankle was swollen, a bad twist, maybe worse, probably from the terrain in the dark, but the foot was the right color, and he could move the toes when she asked him to, which meant the bones were likely intact. "It's going to hurt for a week," she told him. "You need to stay off it." Carl made a sound that suggested this was incompatible with how he lived his life. "Off it," she said firmly. "Yes, ma'am," Tommy said, in a way that made it unclear whether he was answering for Carl or himself. She wrapped the ankle with strips cut from a flour sack. She'd find proper bandaging, but this would do for now, and elevated it with a folded blanket. She went back to the kitchen. Garrett had not moved. He was still bent over the coffee mug, but his shoulders had dropped from where they'd been, the high locked position of someone running on will, and he looked like a man finally setting down something very heavy. She got more coffee. She sat across from him. He looked up. "Talk," she said quietly. "About what?" "About however bad it was out there. Because you need to, and nobody's listening in here except me." He looked at her for a long moment. Outside, the blizzard stated its case against the windows, loud and absolute. "I almost lost Tommy," he said. "He went down in a drift up on the ridge, just went down, couldn't see him. We were roped together and I felt the rope go slack and I couldn't find him for 2 minutes. He stopped. 2 minutes sounds like nothing. "It doesn't sound like nothing," she said. "It felt like—" He stopped again, his jaw tightened. "He's 19 years old. He's inside and he's warm," she said. "I know." A pause. Carl went down coming off the ridge. Ankle caught wrong on the rock beneath the snow. He's a big man, and he went down hard, and we had to— He shook his head. "It took all of us. Hank hurt his shoulder getting him up." "Hank's shoulder?" "Left one. He won't say much about it." A look crossed his face. "He never says much about anything. He'll let me look at it." "Probably not. But you can try." He drank his coffee. "Cattle are in the middle pasture. 62 head. We got all of them." He said this last part differently, with the quiet weight of someone counting what they managed to save, which was the only accounting available to them now. "All 62, she said. "All 62. They sat in the sound of the storm for a moment. Then Evelyn said, without intending to say it quite yet, "The woman in the photograph, on the high shelf." His hand stilled on the mug. She hadn't planned it. But something about the night, the cold that had gotten into everyone, the rawness that the hours outside had scraped all the way down to, made the careful distances feel like something she couldn't maintain anymore, didn't want to maintain. "My wife," he said. His voice came out flat and careful. "Clara." "I'm sorry," she said. "I moved it by accident when I was dusting. I didn't mean—" "It's all right." He wasn't looking at her. "She died 4 years ago, winter. Different kind of sickness, not the weather." He stopped. "She'd been here 3 years. We built this place together, her and me. The kitchen, the way it was designed, the space, that was her. She knew what a kitchen needed." Evelyn thought about the kitchen. The counter space, the generous cold pantry, the thoughtful arrangement of the range. She had always assumed someone had known what they were doing. "She sounds like she was capable," she said. "She was." A long pause. "She was also the only person I ever knew who could make this place feel like something other than work." He looked up. His eyes had that exhausted honesty in them, all the usual management stripped away by the cold and the hours. And then she wasn't here anymore. There it was. The whole architecture of him, the containment, the distance, the house maintained but not cared for, all of it explained in 2 sentences. She sat with it for a moment, not trying to smooth it over. "My mother died when I was 17, she said. "And before that my father left. Not died, left. Which is a different kind of loss." She looked at her hands around the coffee mug. "I spent a long time thinking I was doing fine because I was functioning, working, keeping going. It took me a while to understand that functioning and being all right are not the same thing." He was looking at her. "You're not all right?" he asked. Not a challenge, a real question. "I'm better than I was," she said. "Being here has helped. Having somewhere that needs me to actually show up." She paused. "I don't think you're all right either." The blizzard pressed against the house. In the main room, she could hear Carl saying something low, and Hank responding, and Tommy's younger voice carrying over both of them. Garrett was quiet for a long time. She let him be quiet. She'd learned that his silences were not empty. "No," he said finally. "I'm not." It cost him something to say it. She could see that plainly. For a man who had spent 4 years running a tight perimeter around everything internal, the 2 words were a significant breach. Not dramatic. Nothing about this man was dramatic, but real. "I know," she said simply. He looked at her. The exhaustion in his face was still there, but something else had opened in it. Something that had maybe been closed a long time. Not fixed, not resolved, just open, which was a beginning. She stood up. "I'm going to get more food out and check on Hank's shoulder, whether he wants me to or not. He won't like it. He'll survive his discomfort." She picked up the coffee pot. "There's soup on the range. Eat something more than coffee." She went into the main room. Behind her, she heard the scrape of his chair as he got up to do exactly that. And something in her chest eased just slightly. The way things ease when something hard is survived and the surviving of it becomes real. Outside, the blizzard had built itself to its fullest terrible height, howling at the windows, declaring itself the largest thing for 100 miles in any direction. Inside the ranch house, the fires burned and the soup simmered, and 6 people who had no particular reason to have become anything to each other sat in the same rooms, alive and warming, in the way that people who have come through something together sometimes find themselves closer to the truth of things than they meant to get. Evelyn checked Hank's shoulder. Bruised badly, possibly strained, he endured her examination with the stoic resignation of a man who had learned that resistance to medical attention was not a battle worth fighting. She wrapped it. He said nothing that constituted thanks and everything that constituted it anyway. She went back to the kitchen near midnight, after the men had settled and the house had gone quiet except for the storm. She sat at the work table with a cup of tea and her notebook and didn't write anything in it. Just sat. She thought about what Garrett had said, about Clara and about the kitchen, and about a person who could make a place feel like something other than work. She thought about her own answer to his question, that she was better than she was, that being here had helped. She hadn't planned on meaning it quite as completely as she did. The storm exhausted itself sometime before dawn, and by morning the world was still, buried and white and absolutely silent, the way the world goes silent after something very large has said everything it had to say. Evelyn was up before the light. She built the fire and started breakfast, and when Garrett came down the stairs at 4:30 and stopped in the kitchen doorway, looking at her standing at the range with the lamp burning and the coffee already made, he didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "You're still here." Same words as the morning after the first storm, but different. Something underneath them had changed. "Still here," she said. She handed him the coffee. He took it, and this time his fingers did brush hers briefly, and neither of them said anything about it, and outside the snow lay deep and white and still in the first pale suggestion of a winter dawn, and somewhere in the valley below the cattle stood alive in the middle pasture, all 62 of them, which was what they had been able to save and would have to be enough. The days after the blizzard had a quality of aftermath to them, not peaceful exactly, but quieter in a way that felt earned. Carl stayed off his ankle for 4 days, which was 2 fewer than Evelyn had recommended, and spent those 4 days sitting at the kitchen table with his enormous hands wrapped around coffee mugs, talking to her while she worked in a way that she gradually understood was his version of being useful. Carl Dumont talked the way some men chopped wood, steadily, with genuine effort, producing something necessary. He told her about Minnesota and his mother's farm and a girl he'd been engaged to at 20 who had married someone else, and how he'd headed west the following spring. Not because of the girl, he was very clear about this, but because he'd been thinking about heading west anyway, and the timing was incidental. She listened and responded and kept cooking, and after the first day, Carl seemed to understand that this was a satisfactory arrangement and settled into it comfortably. Hank's shoulder healed slower than he wanted and faster than she expected. He wore the wrap she'd made for 3 days before quietly removing it, and she let him, because Hank Burgess was the kind of man who monitored his own body with the same steady attention he applied to everything else. And if he said he was fine, the probability was high that he was fine. Tommy Reeves had been quieter since the blizzard. Not troubled. She'd watched him carefully enough to make that distinction, but quieter in the specific way of someone who has had a significant experience and is processing it privately, turning it over, figuring out what it means about who they are. He did his work with the same willingness as before, maybe more of it, maybe with more intention behind the willingness. One morning she caught him staring at the North Ridge, visible now from the lower pasture in the clear post-storm air, the gap they'd come through that night looking impossibly narrow from this distance. And there was something in his face that was not fear and was not quite courage either, but was somewhere in the territory where the two things meet and negotiate. She didn't say anything to him. Some things needed to be left alone to finish becoming what they were going to be. Garrett was different in a way she couldn't entirely map. Not dramatically different. Nothing about him was ever dramatic. But the careful perimeter he'd maintained, that deliberate practiced containment, had developed what she could only describe as gaps. Small ones, and he was clearly aware of them, and he didn't always try to close them immediately, which was the thing she noticed most. He came into the kitchen in the evenings with less pretense about why he was there. He sat at the table and talked to her not just about the ranch, but about his thinking, what he was planning for spring, what the cattle numbers needed to look like, what improvements the south fence line needed. The distinction between practical information and conversation had blurred, and he seemed to be letting it blur. One evening, he brought a book from the main room, the face-down novel she'd noticed on the table in her first week, still unfinished, and sat at the kitchen work table and read while she did the last of the day's tidying. He didn't explain himself. He just sat there and read, and she moved around the kitchen doing what needed doing, and the silence between them was entirely comfortable, which was something she hadn't quite experienced with him before. She thought about what Ezra had said. This place was bad before you came. She thought about it and then tried not to think about it too much, because thinking about it too much led to a conversation she was not ready to have with herself about what this place had become to her and what that meant about the original plan, which had been to get through the winter and reassess in the spring. The spring was feeling less like a reassessment point and more like a problem. She was aware of this. She was also aware that she had 41 cents when she arrived, and that feelings, however real, were not a financial plan, and that the question of what she was doing here beyond her contracted position had a practical dimension that her feelings were not equipped to resolve on their own. She said none of this out loud. She cooked and cleaned and managed the kitchen and the house, and she watched the days of December tick past and tried to be practical. The Saturday before Christmas, Garrett came in from the barn in the middle of the afternoon. Unusual, the middle of the day was not a time he was typically indoors, with the look of a man who had been thinking about something for several days and had arrived at a decision about it. She was making pastry. Her hands were in the lard and flour, which meant she couldn't turn around conveniently, so she stayed at the work table and said, "The coffee's on the range," and he said, "I know," but didn't get coffee and didn't sit down. She kept working the pastry. "The season ends next week," he said. "I know. The men will take their wages, and most of them will head to Bozeman for Christmas. Come back in February when the spring work starts picking up." A pause. "That's the usual arrangement." "All right. Which means the ranch will be quiet, just me and Ezra, who never goes anywhere." Another pause. "And you, if you're still here." She turned around then because this required looking at him. Her hands were still floury. "What are you saying?" she asked. He was standing near the door, which was slightly frustrating because she couldn't read his face well at this distance, and she needed to read his face. Your position was through the winter season, he said. That's what was agreed. Yes. Winter season, by the usual definition, ends around March. Technically, you're contracted through March. I'm aware. But the work lightens considerably between January and February. The ranch doesn't require a full-time cook when the crew is down to 2 people. She felt something move in her chest. She kept her face neutral. Are you releasing me from the contract? No. He said it quickly enough that it told her something. I'm asking you what you want to do. There was that question again. The same one he'd asked her in her 3rd week, sitting at the kitchen table with his coffee. What do you want? He kept returning to it like a man who had decided her answer mattered and was prepared to keep asking until he understood it. I want to know why you're asking, she said. He crossed the room. Not fast. He didn't do anything fast that didn't require it, but with the deliberateness of a man making a decision with each step. He stopped on the other side of the work table. Because I'm not going to pretend this is only about a cooking position anymore, he said. And I don't think you are either. The pastry was going to get overworked if she left her hands in it. She pulled them out and brushed them together over the bowl, not looking at him. Garrett, she said carefully. I know what I am, he said. I know this place is hard. I know it's not an easy situation. He stopped. He was clearly a man saying something he had been constructing for some time, and still found it imprecise when it came out. I'm not asking you to decide anything right now. I'm asking if you're willing to stay past the end of the contracted period. In whatever capacity makes sense. We can figure out what that looks like. She looked at him. He looked back. No armor in it. Just him, directly, which was something she'd only seen a handful of times, and each time it had cost him something. You are a complicated man to work for, she said. I know. You were going to send me away the day I arrived. I know. And now you're asking me to stay past the contract. Yes. A pause. People change their minds. You specifically, she said. I wouldn't have guessed that was in your character. The corner of his mouth moved. It happens occasionally, under sufficient provocation. She looked at her floury hands. She looked at the pastry bowl, which represented tomorrow's apple tart, which she'd been planning because she'd found dried apples in the back of the cold pantry that nobody had remembered were there, and she hated to waste things. She thought about Cincinnati. She thought about the train platform in Bozeman, and standing there with her carpet bag while everyone else was collected by people who had been waiting for them. She thought about 41 cents and a folded newspaper advertisement, and the specific quality of desperation that had made a remote Montana ranch seem like a reasonable destination. She thought about the kitchen, Clara's kitchen, built by someone who knew what a kitchen needed, and how she had made it her own without trying to, which was the only way anything real ever became yours. I'll stay through February, she said, and then we reassess. Something shifted in his face. Not relief exactly. He didn't perform relief any more than he performed anything else, but a settling, a quieting of something that had been running under tension. February, he said. Don't agree too fast, she said. I have conditions. He raised an eyebrow slightly, which for him was the equivalent of a surprised expression. Conditions. The hinge on the barn's south door has needed replacing for 3 weeks. I want it fixed before Christmas. That's a ranch maintenance issue, which keeps getting deferred. I hear about it every morning from Carl. She picked up a cloth and wiped her hands. Second, Tommy Reeves is 19 years old, and he's been sending money home to his family in Nebraska every month, which I know because he asked me to help him write the letter in November because his handwriting is poor. He works harder than anyone here except you and Hank, and he's paid less. That should be addressed. Garrett stared at her. You're negotiating ranch wages as a condition of your own employment. I'm identifying an obvious problem and suggesting it's a good time to address it. And the third condition? The coffee cup, she said. The one on the far hook. The painted one. He went very still. She kept her voice even. It's been there unused for 4 years. I haven't touched it. But I think Clara would have been practical enough to know that an unused cup is just a sad object, and that using things is a better way to honor the person who chose them than treating them like something in a museum. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the wind moved across the pasture in a long, low sound. She had said too much. She was almost certain she had said too much, had crossed a line that she hadn't clearly seen until she was already past it. Garrett looked at the hook where the cup hung. He was quiet long enough that she began mentally composing an apology. Then he went to the hook. He took the cup down. He held it for a moment, turning it in his hands. The small painted pattern on the side, blue flowers on cream, worn slightly at the handle from use in a previous life. He set it on the work table in front of her. "Use it," he said. His voice was not entirely level. "She'd have liked you." The words landed somewhere in her chest and stayed there. She picked up the cup. She went to the range and poured coffee into it. The cup fit her hand in a way that felt like something she wasn't going to think too hard about, and she set it on the edge of the work table where she could reach it while she finished the pastry. "The barn hinge," Garrett said, after a moment, in a voice that had returned most of the way to his normal register. 3 weeks, she said. "I'll have Carl do it tomorrow when he can put weight on the ankle again." "Thank you. And Tommy's wages I'll address at the end of the season payout." A pause. It should have been addressed already. "Yes," she agreed, without making anything of it. He stood in the kitchen for another moment, and she got the sense he was waiting for something, though she couldn't have said what. Then he pulled out the chair at the end of the work table, not his chair at the head of the dining table, but the working chair, the one she used, and sat down. "What are you making?" he asked. "Apple tart. For tomorrow." "You found the apples in the back of the pantry." "You knew they were there?" "I knew something was back there." He watched her hands go back into the pastry. "I don't know what half of what's in that pantry is. Clara managed all of it." "Someone put those apples up," she said. "They're good. A little dry, but the flavors held." She put up everything in the fall, every year. He leaned his arms on the table. "I kept doing it the first 2 years after. Felt like stopping meant something. Then I stopped." She kept her hands in the pastry and said nothing, just let the information exist between them without needing to respond to every piece of it. She had learned that this was what he needed. Not commentary, but presence. Someone to say things into without the words being immediately returned to him in a different shape. "Does it get easier?" he asked. He was looking at his hands on the table. I know that's a broad question." "It doesn't get easier exactly," she said. "It gets different. The shape of it changes." She thought about her mother, about the specific grief of 17-year-old Evelyn standing in a boarding house kitchen that was now her responsibility. At some point you realize you've gone a whole day without the loss being the first thing you thought about, and you feel guilty about that, and then you realize the guilt is also part of it passing. It's not a clean process. "No," he said, "it's not." She shaped the pastry into the pan and trimmed the edges. The kitchen smelled of flour and the wood smoke from the range, and the coffee that she'd poured into Clara's cup and not yet drunk. "She would have had opinions about you," Garrett said. He said it with something that was almost warmth. "Strong opinions." Clara had strong opinions about everything and no particular reluctance to express them. "Then she and I would have gotten along," Evelyn said. He looked at her. That almost smile, the most expression his face usually offered. "Probably," he said. "Yeah." The apple tart went into the oven. Evelyn picked up Clara's cup and drank the coffee, which had gone slightly cool but was still good. And Garrett sat at the work table and didn't go back to whatever he'd been doing in the barn. And outside, the pale December afternoon moved slowly toward the early dark of winter. And somewhere on the property, a door that had been not quite closed and not quite open for a very long time shifted, quietly, in a direction it hadn't moved in 4 years. The men came back in for supper, and the evening arranged itself the way evenings did. The comfortable noise of people who have spent a day working in the cold coming into warmth and food, the specific density of a shared meal, Carl telling a story about a horse he'd once known in Minnesota that had more personality than most people he'd met, Tommy listening with the focused attention he gave to any story that sounded like it was going somewhere. Evelyn served the supper and cleared the table and refilled the coffee and did all the things that made an evening like this function, and she was aware the whole time of Garrett at the head of the table, quieter than the others, as always, but present in a different way than he had been 2 months ago, more inside the room than observing it from a careful distance. At the end of the evening, after the men had gone to the bunkhouse, she washed the last of the dishes and dried them and set them in their places. Clara's cup she put, Not back on the far hook, but on the shelf near the range, where it would be easy to reach. She stood there a moment looking at it. Small painted flowers, blue on cream. A practical object that had belonged to someone who knew what kitchens needed. She turned out the lamp and went to her room, and for the first time since she'd arrived in Montana, she lay in the dark and did not think about what came next, but just let where she was be enough, which was rare and harder than most people admitted, and which she had learned, slowly, was the beginning of something that resembled peace. Outside, the snow was still deep on the ground, and the stars were out, and the cattle stood in the middle pasture, 62 of them, which was what they had saved and which was going to have to be enough, and was. The week before Christmas, the men collected their wages and left for Bozeman in stages, the way water drains, gradually, then all at once. Carl went first, on a Monday, with his ankle sufficiently recovered and his saddlebag packed with what she suspected was every warm garment he owned. He shook Garrett's hand at the door, and then turned to Evelyn with the particular expression of a large man trying to communicate something he didn't have precise words for. "Best winter I've had on a ranch," he said, "and I've had 11. "The biscuits," she said. "It's not only the biscuits." He said it seriously, which was its own kind of statement from Carl. "You take care, Miss Pierce." "You too, Carl." He rode out. She watched him go from the kitchen window and felt the house shift slightly in his absence, the way houses do when someone who filled space with their presence is suddenly not filling it anymore. Tommy left on Wednesday, after coming into the kitchen early that morning while she was starting the bread, and standing near the door in the way he did when he had something to say and wasn't sure how to begin it. "You need something?" she asked. "No, I just—" He stopped, started again. "I wanted to say thank you for the letter writing and for the, everything." He meant the blizzard. He meant those 2 minutes in the snow when the rope went slack and Garrett couldn't find him. He meant coming inside afterward to hot food and a woman who wrapped Carl's ankle without making anyone feel worse about the situation than they already did. "You did good out there," she said. "On the ridge." He looked at her with the startled gratitude of a 19-year-old who had not expected the subject to be addressed directly. "I was scared half to death." "Yes. And you kept moving anyway." She shaped a loaf without looking up. "That's what matters." Tommy was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'm coming back in February," in a tone that was telling her rather than informing her, like he wanted her to know that whatever this place had become, he was planning to keep coming back to it. "Good," she said. "I'll have something good for supper the night you get back." He smiled. The real one, not the self-conscious version he deployed when he was trying to seem older than he was, and left. Pete Voss departed without ceremony. Hank Burgess was the last of the hands to go on Thursday afternoon, and he stood outside the barn with Garrett for a long time in a conversation she couldn't hear and didn't try to, because some conversations between men who have worked together for 11 years don't require an audience. When Hank came inside to collect his bag from the bunkhouse, he stopped in the kitchen doorway. She'd half expected this. "Miss Pierce," he said. "Mr. Burgess." He looked at her with those deliberate eyes. "You did good work this season." "Thank you." "I mean the other kind too, not just the cooking." He said it plainly, with no elaboration, which was Hank's way of saying something significant. Minimally, accurately, once. She nodded. He nodded. He left. And then it was just Evelyn and Garrett and Ezra Fell, who had remained through all of it as though he'd never considered leaving, which he probably hadn't. Ezra occupied the bunkhouse alone with the settled comfort of a man for whom solitude was a natural condition, and company was the thing that required adjustment. The ranch went quiet in a way that was different from any quiet she'd experienced in it before. The constant low-level noise of 6 working men, boots on floors, voices in the yard, equipment being moved, simply stopped, and what replaced it was the deep, specific silence of a working property at rest. Wind, cattle, the range fire, her own footsteps on the kitchen floor. She kept cooking because 2 men and herself still needed feeding, and because the kitchen was the place in the house where she understood herself most clearly. Christmas Eve arrived the way it tends to. Suddenly, as though you'd been watching it approach and then looked away for a moment, and it was simply there. The sky that afternoon was the particular dark blue of deep winter, and by 4 o'clock it was coming on dark, and the snow that had been on the ground for weeks had a clean crust on it from the previous night's cold that caught the last of the light and held it briefly before letting it go. She had been planning something for dinner and had said nothing about it, partly because she wasn't sure what she was planning until she was doing it. She went into the cold pantry in the afternoon and assessed what she had. The remaining dried apples, which she'd been managing carefully. The last of the good flour. Butter she'd been preserving. Eggs. Some salt pork that was better quality than the rest, which she'd set aside without entirely knowing why. She made a proper dinner. Not extravagant. Extravagance wasn't available to her and wouldn't have felt right if it were. But considered. A roasted salt pork with dried herbs from the bunch she'd hung in the kitchen her second week. Roasted root vegetables. Fresh bread, the best batch she'd made all season. The kind that came out right when your hands and the dough and the heat of the oven were all in agreement. And a second apple tart, better than the first because she'd had a month's more familiarity with that oven's particular habits. Ezra ate in the bunkhouse, as was his custom when it was just the three of them. He had a long-established routine, she'd learned, and the routine included not intruding on the house in the evenings, which she suspected was a deliberate courtesy that he'd developed over years without it ever being discussed. So it was just her and Garrett at the table. He came in from the evening barn check at 6, and she heard him stop in the doorway between the main room and the kitchen. She didn't turn around because she was pulling the bread out and the timing mattered. "What is all this?" he said. "Dinner. It's—" He stopped. She could hear him looking at the table, which she'd set properly for the first time. Plates in their right places, the lamp moved to the center where it gave the best light. "You didn't have to do this." "I know." She set the bread on the board. "Sit down." He sat down. They ate in a way that was different from the meals they'd shared over the past 2 months. Without the men, without the operational conversation that filled the table most evenings, there was nothing to talk around. They talked directly, or they were quiet, and the quiet was not uncomfortable. He told her about the first Christmas he'd spent on the property, just him and Hank and 2 other men who'd since moved on, all of them eating beans out of a pot because nobody had thought far enough ahead to plan for a real meal. She laughed at that. Actually laughed, not the polite version she deployed in professional situations. And he looked at her with the expression of a man who has discovered he likes the sound of something and is slightly surprised by his own reaction. She told him about a Christmas in Ohio when she was 12, before everything got harder. When her mother had made a dinner so elaborate it had taken 3 days of preparation and the entire house had smelled of it. She could still describe it in precise detail. The smells, the order the dishes came out, the particular color of the light in the kitchen that afternoon. The way her mother had been happy that day in an uncomplicated way she hadn't often managed. "She sounds like someone worth missing," he said. She was. She looked at her plate. "Most people worth having are also worth missing. That seems to be how it works." He was quiet for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "It does." After dinner, she cut the apple tart and they ate it at the table with coffee. Hers and Clara's cup, which had simply become her cup over the past week, migrating naturally from the shelf to her hand the way objects do when they find their right place. Garrett had watched this happen without saying anything, which she understood as acceptance. Outside, snow had started again. She could hear it against the window, a soft, dry sound, the kind of snow that fell without drama and accumulated with patience. The lamp on the table made the room smaller than it was, more contained, the circle of light pressing the darkness back to the walls. Garrett was looking at his coffee cup. He had the look he sometimes got when he was thinking his way toward something and hadn't arrived yet. She waited. She'd learned his timing. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to know that I've been thinking about it for a while. I'm not saying it because of the occasion. I'd have said it eventually regardless." "All right." He looked up. "Stay. Not through February and then reassess. Stay." He stopped. Tried again. "Not as the cook, or not only that. I'm asking you to stay as my partner. In this ranch and in whatever this is." He gestured between them slightly, a small movement that was more articulate than he probably knew. "I know that's not a simple thing to ask. I know what you'd be saying yes to. The winters, the work, the distance." He paused. "Me, which is its own category of difficulty." She looked at him across the table, in the lamplight, in the falling snow. "Garrett," she said, "you don't have to answer tonight." "I know I don't." She put her coffee cup down. "I want to say something first." He waited. I came here with 41 cents and nowhere to go, she said. I want you to understand that clearly because I want you to understand that I'm not saying what I'm about to say because I have no other options. I did have other options. There would have been other positions, other towns, other situations I could have found my way into. I'm not staying because I'm desperate. I know that, he said. I'm saying it because I need to know that you know it. She looked at him steadily. I'm staying because I want to stay. Because this place, she stopped and took a breath and said the true thing. Because this place already feels like mine. Because the kitchen and the cold pantry and the cattle in the middle pasture and the rope between the house and the barn. I already feel responsible for all of it, in a way I've never felt responsible for anything I've worked in before. And me? He said. Quiet. Serious. And you? She said, just as quietly. Yes. Something in his face changed. Not dramatically, because nothing in his face ever changed dramatically, but it changed in a real way, the kind of real that doesn't perform itself for an audience, that simply is what it is. He reached across the table and took her hand, which was the most straightforwardly open gesture she'd seen from him in 2 months, and she let him. I'm not easy, he said. I know that. I'm aware. She looked at their hands on the table. I'm not particularly easy either. I reorganize things without asking, and I have opinions about how kitchens function, and I apparently negotiate ranch wages as personal conditions of employment. Tommy's getting a raise in February. I know, you told me. I should have done it last year. Yes, she agreed. The corner of his mouth moved into that almost smile she'd spent 2 months learning to read. We're going to argue, he said. Probably often. I don't back down easily. Neither do I. He held her gaze. Good, he said, with a conviction that she understood was not ironic. Outside, the snow fell on the silent ranch, on the barn with its repaired south hinge, on the middle pasture where 62 cattle stood in their winter patience, on the bunkhouse where Ezra Fell was almost certainly awake, reading something by lamplight, and had no particular opinions about whatever was happening in the main house. They didn't stay at the table much longer. There wasn't a need for dramatic extension of the moment. It had been what it was, and that was sufficient. She cleared the dishes and he helped her, which he'd started doing a week ago without explanation, moving naturally into the space beside her at the wash basin the way people move into routines that fit them. Later, she stood in the kitchen window in the dark, looking out at the snow coming down in the lamplight from the barn Ezra had left burning. The tart pan was cleaned, the dishes were done. Clara's cup sat on the shelf by the range. She thought about all the kitchens she'd worked in, the boarding house in Ohio at 15, her hands too small for some of the work, but her instincts already good. The hotel in Columbus with its industrial scale and its reliable impersonality. The Cincinnati family who praised her and moved to Boston without a second thought. The gaps between positions when she'd lain in rented rooms and counted what she had and calculated how much time she had to find the next thing. She thought about the newspaper advertisement, worn through at the folds. Must be capable of hard work and difficult conditions. She had read those words 47 times on a train heading west, looking for something that read like a reason. What she'd found was this: a house that needed living in, men who needed feeding, a man who had built something real out of hard ground and hard winters and sheer unrelenting will, and who had been maintaining it in isolation and calling that surviving when it was something considerably less than that. What she had found, she understood now, was a place that needed her specifically. Not just a cook, not just capable hands and good instincts in a kitchen, but her particular stubbornness, her directness, her unwillingness to accept emotional distances she could see through. The way she fixed latches without being asked, the way she listened without filling the silence, the way she used a cup. You didn't always know what you were looking for until you stopped looking and found it anyway. That was the thing nobody told you. You could spend years moving through the world with a plan, with a list of requirements, with a clear sense of what the destination was supposed to look like. And then a snowstorm could trap you in a place you'd intended to be temporary, and the temporary could become the truest thing that ever happened to you. The spring came slow and cold, and then all at once, the way springs do in Montana, weeks of gray reluctance, and then a morning when something in the air changed and the snow started pulling back from the lower pastures, and the cattle moved differently, with a looseness in their bodies that meant they felt the warmth coming too. Tommy Reeves rode back in the second week of February, as he'd promised, and Evelyn had pot roast on the range when he came through the door, and he sat down at the table and ate 2 plates of it and said, "I told my mother about your cooking with the simple pride of someone sharing a good thing." Carl came back the week after, his ankle fully healed, and resumed his place at the table as though he'd never left it. And within 24 hours, the kitchen had its noise back, and Evelyn found she had missed it more than she'd let herself acknowledge. Hank Burgess returned on a Monday with the look of a man who had spent 6 weeks in Bozeman and found it satisfactory but not sufficient. And he shook Garrett's hand at the door and then looked at Evelyn and at Garrett and at the particular arrangement of the 2 of them standing together in the doorway of the house. And he said nothing, but the expression on his face was the Hank Burgess equivalent of a significant reaction. "Good to be back," was what he actually said. "Coffee's on," Evelyn told him. He nodded and came inside. The spring work began. The cattle were moved to the upper range in stages as the ground dried. The south fence line got the repair it needed. New calves arrived, 12 of them, which was more than Garrett had projected, and he watched each one with the quiet satisfaction of a man counting what the land gives back when you take care of it. Evelyn learned to read a cattle count and learned the difference between a sick animal and a cold one, and learned which of the ranch dogs could be trusted not to scatter the herd. By April, the valley had color in it again. Brown turning to green in the low pastures, the creek running full and fast, the air carrying something in it that the winter months absolutely didn't have. The neighbors came by in the spring, as neighbors did. The Halverson family from the road to town, the Deaver operation from the eastern section of the valley, a few others she hadn't met yet. They came to check on things, to trade information about water rights and cattle prices and the condition of the road, the way people in remote country maintained their connections to each other through practical exchange. They came also to look at her. She understood this. She was new, and this was a small enough world that new required examination. Margaret Halverson, wife to old Pete, a woman of 50 with sharp eyes and a directness that Evelyn recognized and respected, sat in the main room with coffee and looked at the house with the assessing eye of someone who had been in it before. "It's different," Margaret said. "I've been maintaining it," Evelyn said. "No." Margaret shook her head. "It was maintained before. This is different." She looked at Evelyn with those sharp eyes. "It looks like someone lives here." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said. "I suppose it does." Margaret Halverson left with 2 jars of preserved apples that Evelyn had put up in the fall. She'd put up everything in the fall, working from Clara's notes that she'd found in a kitchen drawer and read carefully and then followed, not because she had to, but because they were good notes from someone who had known what she was doing, and a recipe for cornbread that Margaret had asked for and been given without hesitation. That evening, she told Garrett about the visit. They were in the kitchen. They ended up in the kitchen most evenings because the kitchen was where the warmth was and where the light was best, and because that had become the natural center of the house again. "Margaret Halverson's going to tell everyone in the valley about that cornbread recipe," he said. "Good," she said. "Then they'll come back." He looked at her. "You want people coming out here?" "I want this place to be part of the valley," she said, "not separate from it." She looked at him steadily. "You've been managing this ranch like it's a self-contained operation that doesn't need anything from the outside world. That's partly what makes winter so hard. People need people, Garrett. Even difficult particular people who prefer not to admit it." He was quiet for a moment. "You're going to change everything," he said. Not an accusation, something closer to a fact he was arriving at. "I'm going to improve some things," she said. "The rest of it was already good." He looked at her. The kitchen smelled of coffee and the dried herbs on the hooks and the spring air coming through the window she'd opened slightly, the first window she'd opened since November. "I know," he said. And then, because he was the kind of man who said things once when he meant them and didn't repeat himself, "I know I don't say enough." "You say what you mean," she told him. "That's rarer than you think. It's enough." He held her gaze for a moment, nodded once. Outside, the valley was green and wide, and the sky above Montana was the color of something you couldn't name that had no gray in it at all, just blue, running all the way to the edges of the world. And the cattle were in the upper range where there was good water and good grass. And the ranch that had spent 4 years in a kind of suspended functioning was simply, quietly, fully alive again. None of it was easy. Evelyn never expected it to be easy, and would not have trusted it if it were. There were mornings when the cold came back without warning, and the work was harder than anyone had prepared for. There were arguments, real ones, not gentle disagreements, Because two people who both mean what they say, and neither of whom backs down easily, will argue. And that is not a failure, but a characteristic of anything built to last. There were days when Garrett went somewhere inside himself that she couldn't reach, and she had to wait, which was one of the hardest skills she'd ever developed. And there were the other days, the ones where everything worked the way it was supposed to work, and the kitchen was warm, and the men came in from the cold and sat down to something worth eating, and the lamp on the table made everything in the room look like it was exactly where it belonged. She had spent years moving through other people's spaces, other people's kitchens, other people's houses, other people's arrangements of what a life was supposed to look like. She had been good at those spaces. She had never been of them. This was different. This was hers in the specific way that things become yours, not through ownership, but through investment, through the hours put in and the difficulty endured and the choice made daily to show up and stay and keep showing up. The home she had been looking for was not on a map. It had never been on a map. It was something built between people who were willing to be changed by each other, which was the most frightening and most necessary thing she had ever agreed to. She had agreed to it one winter night in Montana, across a kitchen table, with snow coming down outside and a cup of coffee growing cold in her hands, and a man who didn't say easy things but said true ones, looking at her steadily across the lamplight. She had said yes. It remained in every way that counted the truest thing she ever did.